All right. Keep those hands up if you think it was fun. Yeah, all right, maybe, sort of. I see some hands dropping. We're not so sure we think it was fun in the reading of the book of Leviticus. But the book of Leviticus is one of my absolute favorites. You know why? Pop quiz. First one to unmute and answer this question correctly gets a gold star for the day. Love your neighbor. Who said that? Now we're nervous because we're all staying muted and nobody's jumping on it. Come on, y'all. Love your neighbor. Who said that?
Jesus for one.
Jesus did say that. Very good. So, little quick warning about me. I'm an audience participation preacher, and Zoom is no exception. If I invite you to participate and you don't, I talk longer. All right. I warned Jen about this before. So that's something you'll get used to with me. Jesus said that. Who said it first? Jesus didn't come up with that line. He stole it. Where did it come from? Leviticus.
Old Testament.
Yes, Leviticus. Leviticus. Love your neighbor comes from Leviticus. So when we think about Leviticus, we don't think about that, do we? We think about, I don't know what, lists, right? Leviticus has lots of lists, right? I am a voracious maker of lists. If you were to be sitting with me at my desk right now, you would see all these little notes I keep. Well, the little background's preventing it, but I've got tons of these little notes and scraps of paper. This is how I keep lists. They're scraps of paper that are scattered around my desk. And as someone who travels a lot, my better half makes sure that I have a particular list that you may have heard of that I pay attention to every time I come home, right? And that is a list of things I am to do. Now, I am the father of children, and I have another list that I keep around and remind them of frequently, right? That they are not such fans of. A list of things you don't do, right? Anybody who's raised kids knows that there are things that you encourage your children to do, and there are things that you encourage children not to do. What's the point of reading something that is full of lists of things that you are not allowed to do? Think about that for a second. My kids will tell you that they do not like lists of things they are not allowed to do. They are not fans of those lists. And if that was all there was to raising kids, lists of things to do and things not to do, if that was it, right, my boys would be onto something. I have heard it said that to raise children, to be a parent, kids need three things. All right, here they are. One, to know they are loved. They need to know they are loved. Two, to be told no. To be told no. And three, to be given independence to learn and to make mistakes. So I am the father of four boys. My second oldest son likes to play soccer. Any soccer fans? All right. Any soccer fans? Not so much, maybe? Okay, well, those of you I can see are not soccer fans, but that's okay. Maybe somebody somewhere on the screen is raising their hand, and if so, God bless you. So my second son likes to play soccer. In kids' soccer, kicking the ball back up the field is against the rules. In adult soccer, you kick the ball back to open the field in a different way. Prohibitions at first can seem narrow and, well, prohibitive, right? Don't do that. But still, in light of the overall narrative arc of the scriptures, some of the commands that we find in Leviticus developmentally lead into an ongoing process that goes in surprising directions later in our sacred story. People like to quote Leviticus, right? You know those people. I know you do. You know those people. You see them on certain news networks that shall not be named in the midst of this sermon, right? You hear their voices in different places in the public square for good and not so much, right? You know who those people are. I know who those people are. They like to quote Leviticus, but when you hear that happen, remember something. Random verses, cherry picking, provide a skewed perspective. Read it, the Bible, all of it, any book of it, any part of it, any passage of it, or single verse like I'm preaching on today, in light of the larger story, just like raising kids, right? So those three ideas that we turn back to with raising kids: love, know, and freedom, right? That's an easy way to sum that third thing up. Freedom come up a lot in the pages of Leviticus. So let's talk about the book for a minute. All right. A little bit of background for you, because I like to give that. There are 27 chapters in the book of Leviticus. It is typically grouped into two halves, chapters 1 through 16 and chapters 17 through 27. And each of them takes you on a different adventure. All right. The first 7 chapters, 1 through 7, are about sacrifices, specifically the 5 sacrifices that we're going to talk about this morning. Chapters 8 through 10 are about the priests, because Leviticus is understood and was understood to be an instruction manual for priests, okay? So then you go to chapters 11 through 15, and they provide instructions and rituals for being ceremonially clean or unclean, including food, childbirth, skin diseases, and bodily discharges. This is exciting stuff. Are we excited yet? Chapter 16 is about the Day of Atonement. This is a conversation, an extended conversation about purity, those clean and unclean laws, which are really asking this question. When you read those things, it's asking this question: how do you live in right standing with God? How do you live in right standing with God? And then we move forward. Chapters 17 through 27 are called the Holiness Code. Perhaps you've heard that phrase bandied about by certain people in the world. The Holiness Code concerns how you live your life. It includes things like blood, sex, slander, and land. Something to know about rituals and rules as we get into our conversation this morning. You are going to read things in the book of Leviticus that make absolutely no sense to you and defy modern explanation. Okay, that is going to happen. But those things intuitively meant something to people in the time of Leviticus. They would have been easily understood. Like this one, for example: the laying of hands upon an animal before it is sacrificed. The laying of hands upon an animal before it is sacrificed is laid out in detail in the book of Leviticus. And maybe you've run into this before, where you get this explanation. It's very short and simple, and it goes like this: of course, those people did that, the laying of hands on an animal before it is sacrificed, to transfer their sins onto the animal, the Day of Atonement, right? Maybe it was called, you've heard this expression, the sacrificial goat. Anybody heard that one, right? Or a sacrificial lamb, right? So that animal, typically a goat, of course, they did that to transfer their sins onto the animal. You know what? It doesn't say that anywhere in the book of Leviticus. That explanation that we commonly put to it does not exist. It's not there, right? Not anywhere. So if we're honest about that, we don't understand that. We don't know why they did that. But the people who were there in that moment, the people whose stories are captured in this book, they knew what that meant. All right? So let me put it another way. If I say to you, I drove over to Sue's house, but it took a little longer because of traffic, you know what that sentence means, right? I drove over to Sue's house, but it took a little longer because of traffic. Do you think you know what that sentence means? Anybody? Yeah, all right, good. A couple people are going, yeah, I'm brave enough to think I know what that sentence means. All right, so you know a couple of things that come out of that sentence. You can infer some things, right? First, there was probably a car, right? I drove, so probably a car. There was probably a seat belt. It is 2024, right? And you know what traffic is. We all understand that. But if I had said that sentence to somebody from the time of Leviticus, would they have understood it? Drove? You drove. Like what? A donkey? A bird? What is traffic? And who is Sue? With that, let's dive into the book a little bit, shall we? Chapter 1, verse 1. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Those opening words could also be translated from the Hebrew as this: God continued calling Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. How we translate those words is important because the opening verse is a continuation. This is one word in the Hebrew. We're translating that line from one word in Hebrew, and that word is Vayikra. Vayikra. This is the Hebrew name of the book. Our title refers to the Levites, right? Leviticus comes from the Levites, the priests who came from the tribe of Levi, because this is a priestly manual. But the word for this book, Leviticus, in Hebrew is Vayikra, one word from which we draw that opening. God continued calling Moses from the tent of meeting, which had another name. That name was the tabernacle. All right? Continued calling. What was God saying before? And how did we get here to this tent of meeting? Apparently, something has been happening between Moses and God at a place, this tent of meeting, and the beginning of Leviticus is a continuation of that thing that is happening. All right, it's already ongoing. We're already there, and we're dropped into it. We dropped in midway through an ongoing story. Verse 1 of Leviticus is like picking up a show on Netflix in the second season of the series. All right. That's what happens if you read Leviticus cold. It's like jumping into a series in season 2. So to understand Leviticus, we have to understand what happened in the book before Leviticus and where that book ended. And that book is Exodus. The book of Exodus begins with the absence of God. God is nowhere to be found. The Israelites are living in Egypt, and to understand that, you have to read the book of Genesis to understand how they got there. In ancient tradition, Genesis is the prologue, the preamble, what I like to call the introduction to any of my sermons, to the book of Exodus. The Exodus story is about the liberation of real people from slavery. All right? So Exodus is considered the Bible's first book in that tradition. Genesis is just a setup that helps explain how Exodus came to be. So here's what happened. The leader, Joseph, dies, and a new Pharaoh comes to power who fears the Israelites because they are growing in this land of Egypt. These Israelites, these slaves, these Hebrews, also built store cities for the Pharaoh. That was their job, which is vital to understanding Leviticus. All right, you got to know what they did in their work, building store cities for Pharaoh, to understand Leviticus. See, a store city is where you take harvested grain and you stockpile it in anticipation of a drought or a famine. So Exodus begins with the Israelites far from home, enslaved by the Pharaoh, and working for a master who is stockpiling the bounty he has received from their labor. If there's a famine, who will the people turn to? The person who has been stockpiling food, right? The Pharaoh. The people would have to pay Pharaoh for the food that he had acquired and stored through their labor, making them even poorer and making him even more wealthy. When it says that the slaves are building storehouses, it's about way more than that. Egypt is a place of systemic injustice and inequality, and we might be able to relate a little bit to that, right? So another line from Exodus: the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly, the text says. The Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar. And this is a call back to something else in the scriptures. This isn't a first thing. This is a call back to a story we read earlier in the scriptures, and that story is the Tower of Babel. All right? When we read that line, it's calling us back to the Tower of Babel, a reference to early empire building. In their harsh labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly, and used them is the English translation. What do you use? You use an object like a pencil, right? You use an object, an animal, a tool, a product. When you hate your job, you say things like, I feel like they are using me. If you are feeling used in a relationship, it is a dehumanizing experience, right? Everybody knows that you don't use people. Egypt is ordered in a particular way. Some are on the top, others are on the bottom. Some are free, some are slaves. Some accumulate through the forced labor of others only to profit from that excess. Some humans exist to be used by other humans. Egypt is ordered in a particular way with a very clear hierarchy of human value. And it appears that there is nothing the Israelites can do to change that. Tomorrow is simply an endless repeat of today. Another word for that is despair. Despair. Things are the way they are, and there is nothing that you can do to change it. So Exodus raises questions along the journey of liberation that unfolds. Who decides how the world gets ordered? Is that up to the rich and the powerful by themselves? We ask that question today sometimes. Do the strongest simply get to say how everything is organized? What does this ordering say about what it means to be human? Maybe a question we should be asking ourselves more often today. What does this ordering of the world say about what it means to be human? Can you move, change, advance, or improve your life in Egypt or wherever you happen to be? Or are things just the way they are and that's it? The turning point comes at the end of chapter 2 of Exodus. The Israelites groaned in their slavery, it says. They cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning and remembered, it says, the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Another callback to Genesis. So God looked upon the Israelites, and God was concerned for them. See, the gods of Egypt are fine with the ordering of the world. Some humans own other humans and use them to build their abundance. But this God is not okay with that arrangement. And this God hears the cry of the people. This God is different, for this is the God of the underdog, subverting the dominant power structures of the day. Sometimes people will talk about God being on their side. You ever hear that? That is the wrong conversation to be having when we talk about God, okay? The much better way of thinking is this. Can you hear the cry? Can you hear the cry? This God hears the cry. See, here's the thing. History is most of the time told by people who win. All right? History is most of the time told by people who win. And they generally tell stories about how they won with the help of their God or gods. This story, Exodus and Leviticus, is a different telling of history. It is the history of the underdogs, a history told by slaves. The God in this story sets out to disrupt the order of the world. You remember the story of Jesus and the blind beggar? Anybody? Here's that show of hands again. Jesus and the blind beggar. All right, I have pastors on this call who aren't raising their hands right now. There we go. Good save. Good save, preacher. So here's what happens in that story, Jesus and the blind beggar, right? The guy is shouting for Jesus, and everybody, what do? All the people around him, they say, hey, be quiet. Be quiet. But Jesus, he hears that cry and he heals that man. Anybody remember Cain and Abel? Where God says to Cain, your brother's blood cries out from the soil. The cry of one with the boot of empire on their neck. If you cannot hear the cry, you are building the empire. If you cannot hear that cry, you are building the empire. When we cry out, we open ourselves to strength and power and spirit beyond ourselves. This cry, it breaks us open, and we become receptive to that which is beyond us individually. This is when healing and saving begin. The people cry out, and God raises up Moses as their liberator. He goes back and forth with Pharaoh, right? There are confrontations, there are plagues, there are frogs and locusts. And the conflict between Moses and Pharaoh is between the God of the Israelites and the gods of Egypt, a conflict between two competing ways of ordering the world, right? Option A, option B. That is where the friction in the story is. How does the world get ordered? They are liberated. They escape. They cross the sea, they dance on the other side, and they meet with God at Sinai, a physical place that is central to what comes before and after the Exodus. The book of Acts in the New Testament is about what happened at Sinai. That's what the book of Acts is about, what happened at Sinai. Sinai is the only place where a group of people claimed to have heard the divine. They enter into covenant here, the place where the human and divine come together as one. Do you remember the speaking of other tongues, right? From the tongues of fire in the book of Acts. Anybody remember that story? Usually there's red balloons and we all wear red, right? We do that on Pentecost. We retell that story at Pentecost every year, okay, right? There is an ancient Hebrew story that the rabbis tell about the sending out of 70 tongues from Sinai throughout all the world so that all of humanity hears God speaking. That story is older than Acts. The tongues of fire in Acts recall what happened at Sinai. God and humanity coming together in relationship as one. Leviticus comes off of the covenants that took place at Sinai, where we hear God say to the Israelites, "You will be for me a kingdom of priests." You were liberated from slavery, so you will show the world what God desires is freedom for all people everywhere all the time. The universal has to be particular. It has to be particularized, okay? We can talk about freedom and love and justice and inequality. We like those words in the UCC. We bandy them around a lot, right? We can talk about that, but these are just ideas until they take on flesh and blood, right? What happens at Sinai is the plan that these people will take these ideas of freedom and justice, equality, solidarity, love, and compassion, and they will put flesh and bone and blood on this vision for humanity. The world is a violent place, one people after another, God says. But you will show the world a different way of being human. This tribe, these Hebrews, don't just exist for their own well-being. This tribe, the Israelites, exist to show the world the path to their liberation, joy, and freedom. In Exodus 25, God says this, "Have them build a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. The divine will be in your midst. Make this tabernacle," God says, "and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." And then the rest of the book of Exodus is detailed instructions on how to build the tabernacle and all the stuff that's in it. All right? 40 chapters in the book of Exodus, 40 chapters, 25 about deliverance from evil, and 15 are about the specific details of building the place where the divine will dwell with the people in their midst. Exodus begins with the absence of God and ends with this line: the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. It begins in Egypt with the divine absence. It ends in the wilderness with the divine presence. In the middle of the people, visible to everybody, it begins with, hey, where is God? And it ends with right here with you, which is where Leviticus picks up, right? A movement from absence to presence, a way of ordering the world. Anybody, show of hands, ever heard the phrase, your body is a temple? Your body, yeah, it's in a Jimmy Buffett song. It's in other places too, but I know it in a Jimmy Buffett song. And if you can put that Jimmy Buffett song in the chat, gold star for you. All right. So this phrase, this idea comes from where? Not a Jimmy Buffett song, Leviticus, the tent of meeting. In Egypt, these people were used. Now they must learn a new way of being, a way of ordering the world, anchored not in slavery, but in freedom, right? When we read that God continued to call to Moses from the tent of meeting, we can hear it this way. God said, here's how you learn to be human. All right. Here's how you learn to order the world all over again in a whole new way. A question for each of you to ponder, and thank you for putting that in the chat. Are you who are here today, hearing this message, are you the sum total of your own story? Think about that. Is your joy, your passion, your desire, your abundance only about you? Think about that for a minute. Or alternatively, as a human, are you here to be a channel through which the divine may flow into the world around you? Maybe, like me, you have never been to rehab. I have never been to rehab. Maybe you've never been to rehab. But maybe, like me, you've got some idea of what it is like when your life seems to collapse all around you, when everything crashes and falls apart. Anybody? Anybody know what that feels like? Yeah, I do too. When you rebuild, you don't run with an anything goes laissez-faire philosophy, do you? Just like when you go to rehab, they don't say to you, just do whatever feels good and wait for the healing to come. No. When you go to rehab, they say things like this: breakfast is at 6 sharp. We write in our journals at this time. We do therapy at that time. Lights out at 8. Life is ordered. Life is structured, simplified, and patterned. To learn a whole new way of being in the world requires structure and form, okay? When we encounter Leviticus and we see all these rules and these lists and these do's and these don'ts, it would be useful to understand why. Here's the why. You can't rebuild your life in chaos. You rebuild your life with structure and order. And Leviticus is about a new ordering of the world. So it has to involve order, intention, and boundaries. That is always how you move in a new direction in your life: order, intention, and boundaries. So earlier I mentioned that Leviticus details 5 types of sacrifices. These sacrifices are given as offerings to God. They are these: the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. The Hebrew word for offering is korban. Korban. Korban means come near. We say offering. Korban means come near. You can come near this God. Okay, when you make an offering, you can come near this God. This God is not distant or detached or petulant. You can come near and have a relationship with this God. The first three offerings are voluntary. They are not required. You do not have to make them. They are about joy, peace, and contentment. The last two are about when you realize that you've done something wrong and you need to make it right. But the first three are entirely up to you. You get to decide when you want and if you want to make an offering out of peace, joy, or contentment with your life. The last two are what you do when you mess up and you need to get right. Okay? Leviticus does not begin, contrary to what we may think, it does not begin with law or with judgment or with condemnation. Leviticus begins with this: if anyone wants to come near to God and offer something in response to joy and gratitude in your life, here is how you do that. Why is that relevant to a people who have just been liberated from slavery? Think about that for a moment. Think about that for a moment. How have you experienced living in tight spaces with other people? Hmm? During the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, I got elected to conference ministry. And so we sold our home in Wichita, Kansas, and left the church that we served. And we packed 4 boys and a dog. We went from 5,000 square feet and 5 bedrooms into 200 square feet and 2 bedrooms on a beach in Galveston, Texas, in an RV that I had bought for fun. So what I can tell you is I have experienced living in tight spaces with lots of other people. What about you? Has it gone smoothly? What about in church? Has there been no gossip, no conflict, no power play in the history of your congregation? That's living with people in tight spaces. I see some smiles to that, right? Or have you regularly had an awareness of making a mess of things? That's what the fourth and the fifth offerings are about, to guide people in how to live at peace with other people. Have you pondered the meaning of the words forgiveness of sin? We don't talk about that all that much in the UCC, right? Sin is a dirty word. It's one of those things, it's in scriptures. We don't talk about it. Forgiveness of sin, right? But Lord's Prayer, right? Communion, forgiveness of sin. Have you pondered the meaning of the words forgiveness of sin in terms of how we live at peace with other people before? To heal and to make amends in order to see that love is flowing among the relationships that you treasure? This is not about an angry God. This is not about a God with whom you do not ever know where you stand. Leviticus opens with this: I liberated you from enslavement. God says, I brought you out. There is a whole new way of being human you can embody. You can come near to me. And when you live into that new way of being, the fullness of who you are meant to truly be, the divine is pleased with you. At that time and that place, a God who is pleased with you, who roots for the underdog, this is something new and powerful in the world. Speaking of powerful stuff, let's talk about the grain offering I mentioned before. The word for this offering in Hebrew is minha, which means gift. Gift, minha, gift. Now, the ingredients that you need to bring, your finest flour. And this is tough because flour is coarse at that time in history, all right? So an offering of the finest flour would have taken lots of crushing and grinding and pressing to get that flour ready, really, really, really fine. And then the priest, they take a handful of flour and oil together with a whole bunch of incense, and then they burn this as a memorial portion on the altar. It's a food offering. It's an aroma that is pleasing to God. Flour, oil, incense. Oil is symbolic in our scriptures, right? The word is anointing, but it is about God's presence resting on someone. When we say anointed in oil, we're talking about God's presence resting on a human. In the ancient world, you would place oil on somebody because there was a sense that the divine is with them, that they have something that they are here to do. That's what it is to be anointed, to acknowledge that somebody has something particular they are here to do. So finest flour, which would have taken a lot of work, oil and incense, those were the ingredients. And what's interesting about incense is that it only gives off a smell after it has been crushed, beaten, burned, or put under tremendous, intense pressure. Remember that. The beautiful thing about incense is that it has to be put through the wringer to really give its beautiful gift of that fragrance. Think about the challenge of this. Imagery of that which had been beaten, broken, ground down. What a powerful significance that would be for those first followers of Jesus, right? Leviticus. These images are put throughout the New Testament and reflected where? In the crucifixion of Jesus. And speaking of the crucifixion, there is a line that is said as Jesus breathes his last. Do you remember it? That line comes from Leviticus. It comes from Leviticus. See, the priests, when they completed the cycle of making those 5 offerings, they would say 3 simple words. It is finished. Speaking of Jesus again, do you remember the story where he drove the money changers from the temple? This is one of my favorites. When Jesus drives out the money changers from the temple, he's got the whip, right? And he's flipping over the tables and it's holy pandemonium. When we talk about the tent of meeting, the tabernacle in Leviticus, we are talking about the temple in Jerusalem too. All right. See, in the time of Moses, this mobile meeting place made its way with the people on the journey. But eventually, as they settled in Jerusalem, as a city grew, King Solomon would build a temple on the site where the tabernacle had come to its rest. Wood and cloth would become marble and stone. And then King Herod, we all remember him, would go on to build a temple that is so grand and strong that one wall of it stands to this very day. It's still there. So the money changer is being driven out. We think this was bad dealing and forbidden. That's how we get that sermon a lot, right? But it shows Jesus' frustration with the temple because the money changers were actually required to be there. That's one of the rules in Leviticus. But the driving them out represents a turning point in the life of the place where the people meet with God. Those 5 offerings, right? These are for everybody. Rich, poor, blind, sighted, in, out, everyone. That was the point of the offerings in recognition of joy and sin. The offerings exist as an equalizer. But the temple had become something else by Jesus' day. It was a place of greed. The funds collected for the poor were being stockpiled in storehouses by the rich. Stockpiled in storehouses by the rich, which takes us forward in Leviticus to the priestly manual, chapters 11 through 15. Taken at face value, reading this text only as it appears to us in our present context, these words are barbaric. Nobody likes these chapters, right? Rituals of cleanliness, explaining the duration of which an individual woman's menstrual cycle will render her unclean, and along with her, anybody who interacts with her during that cycle, right? But as you study these chapters, I invite you to think of them in the context of our present moment in human history. Oceans are rising. Temperatures increasing, calamities compounding. Not everything exists for us to use however we want, whenever we want. There are boundaries built into creation. We live in a culture that resists boundaries, don't we? We live in a culture that resists boundaries, but Leviticus invites us, if you're going to enter in a new ordering of creation, one of the things these regulations do, right, is equip people to see where the boundaries are. Think about our culture with technology for a minute. Think about all the advancements that we've had, how our technologies make our lives better, how they really make a mess of things. Not everything in creation exists to be used by human beings however they want, whenever they want. Animals, resources, people, all of this is to be stewarded with care for the good of the world, because Leviticus reminds us it's a gift. Handle it accordingly. And all of this takes us to chapter 16, the center of the book, where everything that comes before culminates, and where we open up to the final 10 chapters, that holiness code, and it marks a shift in the text. To focus on chapter 16, we need to begin at the end. We look at something like verse 34, which says this: "This is to be a lasting ordinance for you," God says. "Atonement is to be made once a year for all the sins of the Israelites, and it was done as the Lord commanded Moses." Atonement has a rich history. It is the Hebrew word kippur, which means to cover. Yom is the Hebrew word for day. So Yom Kippur is the day of atonement, the day of covering, the one day of the year when all the previous sins of the people get covered. The idea that everyone comes together once a year on a single day to make everything right between these people and their God. All the ways that they've fallen short, all the ways they haven't been true to this new ordering of the world, because that's the thing about the first 15 chapters, a new way of being in and understanding of the world where they are, and yet they still fail. Seem familiar? There's the ideal. And then all the ways that we humans, as a friend of mine says, is messy, right? And make just an absolute wreck of it. And on this one day, the whole community acknowledges that reality and gets a fresh start. One of the realities of this book is when it was written and for whom. Leviticus was written when the Israelites were once again in exile, okay? They had been conquered by a foreign military superpower and driven out of the land that they had journeyed toward in the Exodus story. And throughout this book, if you read it with that knowledge in your head, you see warnings of the exile. You see the divine inviting the people again and again and again and again into this fresh start, this new way of living, and warning them of what may happen if they can't keep their end of covenant. This book was written in large part to explain to a displaced people how they had lost the plot and to invite them back into the story. So the last 10 chapters are called the Holiness Code. They deal in rules and regulations. Do this, not that. And folded into this section is the verse that we have all heard so many times in our lives. It's in chapter 18, verse 22. You know it. And it goes like this: "Don't have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable." And again in chapter 20, where we find that if a man has sex with another man, both of them should be put to death, as should a woman who has sex with an animal. And the animal, by the way, also has to be killed in that situation, along with a whole host of offenses listed in chapter 18 and brought up again with the requisite consequence of death for all of them in chapter 20. And we know these verses as part of what are often called the clobber passages, 5 to 7 verses, often cited across the whole 366,000 verses. Think about that. 5 to 7 verses out of 366,000 verses written in the 66 books of the library we call the Bible, and used those 5 to 7 verses to cause generations worth of pain. So why are these in there? Alongside, as I mentioned, not having sex with animals, or for that matter, the wife of your father, your daughter-in-law, your mother, your aunt, or any woman and her daughter. Because in that time and place, Each of these things destabilized the primary value of family at that time, which we are still today working to move beyond. Thousands of years ago, the world was ordered a certain way, and these commands were written to the man who was the head of the home, and it's written to a man about other men in the family. All right, in the family. So anytime somebody takes chapters 18 and 20 from Leviticus, those two verses about a man lying with another man, and pulls them out and cherry picks them out of this setting and says, today, see, if you are gay, God hates you. Anytime that happens and all that garbage, no, no, that doesn't work. You can't do that. That is not even remotely okay. See, this is about particular relationship that it's destabilized a primary bond, and that bond is family in that time. And these passages are specific. They are about a straight man having sex with another man, specifically then a family member, which would obviously make conversations at the dinner table in that day a little bit awkward, right? That would be a little strange and a little awkward. Remember, these passages are about conduct within the family, the tightest of immediate human bonds, and anything that destabilizes that is a threat to this tribe and their survival in the world at that particular time. Interestingly, right alongside all of this is another important reference in the Holiness Code, and that is to the god Molech. Anybody ever hear the name Molech? Do we know that one? Have I still got you? Are we paying attention? I'm not seeing any hands. Molech from the Old Testament. All right, well, let's talk about Molech for a minute. Molech was a god infrequently on the periphery of the Hebrew scriptures. Molech shows up from time to time. And Molech had a particular role as a god. Molech was the god of child sacrifice. And here in the Holiness Code, Molech shows up. For God says, any Israelite or any foreigner residing among you who sacrifices a child to Molech is to be put to death. Remember what we talked about with sacrifices earlier, those 5 offerings, with offerings that are made first for joy and then for restoration of relationship? Well, at that time and place, it was understood that the gods were demanding. If I needed rain for the crops to grow, or my wife and I were attempting to get pregnant, I would make a sacrifice to the God who was responsible for making that particular thing that I needed happen. It would start with grain. But if it didn't rain, it might be an animal. Because if it didn't rain or we didn't get pregnant, where did I stand with the gods? How would I know? So the sacrifices would get bigger. And once you'd sacrificed an animal, what was there left to give? What was the most valuable thing a human had at that time in history? The firstborn child. Another theme we see come up again and again in scriptures. The most valuable thing a human had at that time was their firstborn child. How anxious that unknowing would make a person, right? On one level, all of Leviticus is about God saying to the people, you don't have to live in that unknowing and anxiety anymore. You can trust. You can come to me in joy, in thanksgiving, in repentance. And here are some rituals. Enact these rituals to express what you are carrying around within your body, your mind, and your spirit. We are good, God says in Leviticus. Atonement has been made. I forgive you. Sit with that for a second. Because also in this section about sex is a bit about farming. In chapter 19, we are reminded to leave a corner of the field, just a corner. Do not go back over your vineyards, God says a second time, but leave some for the poor and the immigrant. Leave some for the poor and the immigrant. I am the Lord your God. And this phrase, it shows up again and again in Leviticus. I am the Lord your God. A call back to where? Egypt. With every instruction, this reminds the people, hey, When you were helpless in your oppression, I remembered you. I took care of you when you were vulnerable. So you do the same. You extend the compassion and the care that I extended you to others. Do not pervert justice. Don't spread slander. Don't do anything to endanger your neighbor's life or hate another in your heart. Any foreigners residing among you, immigrants in your midst, treat them like one of your own people. When you were in a foreign land, I took care of you. So love your neighbor as yourself. Remember that line? Jesus said that. Jesus was quoting Leviticus. In all of this, the divine invites the people to order their lives around remembering their freedom, the power of creation, which is why there's all the stuff about sex, okay? Because sex is the closest we get to divinity, since we have the power in ourselves in coming together to create life itself. Remember family. Remember what justice looks like. Let your ethics, your economy, your care for creation, the trees, fruit, the land, animals, let everything be guided by your story, the gift of liberation and grace that was extended to you. Remember that it is all gift, a gift to be celebrated, a gift to be shared, an offering of joy, beautifully and wonderfully made, just like you. May it be so. Amen and amen.